Hi everybody, welcome to our brief introduction to Enneagram Type 6, which is the Loyalist. Type 6. So these folks, many of whom I am very close with, and I think most of us are, because actually Type 6 are thought perhaps to be the most common type. They are the folks who keep a watchful eye over pretty much all of us. They are the ones who safeguard our values as people, as a community, and the Loyalist, Type 6, is kind of considered to be like the glue that holds society together. When they are healthy, Type 6s are a beautiful thing to see. They trust their own experience, they are productive and logical, they are a clear-eyed judge of character. And when they're healthy, Type 6s tend to believe that in the end, everything will be okay. When they are of average health, Type 6s tend to question everything. I think of these like old buttons that say question authority on them. That's a Type 6 would have that badge on their jacket. When they're average, they find the world to be unsafe, and so they tend to respond with either flight or fight. And they also tend to have a pattern of doing some pretty serious worst case scenario planning. Worriers. When Type 6s are unhealthy, they see danger around every corner. They feel like they're unable to trust themselves. They fear that the world is inherently unfair. And they are people who believe that the people around them can't be trusted, that what they say can't be trusted, and what they do can't be trusted.
Yeah, we're in that fear triad, and we're right at the heart of it. And so fear for them and the way they use it and treat it is exactly what you'd think about for fear. You know,
Yes.
it's that worry, it's that worst case scenario.
Yes.
I would say this is the number that reminds me I don't want to play the game worst case scenario with a 6 because they will win every time.
They'll bury you.
I forgot about that worst case scenario handbook, and it's a game. So deadly sin for Type 6 is fear itself. But for 6s, fear tends to manifest itself as anxiety. So that's like this vague, I mean, we've all experienced anxiety, but for 6s, it's this vague, free-floating sense of apprehension that arises in response to a potential threat. So could be a real threat, could also be something that will never actually come to pass, but that feeling of anxiousness is still present in there. And it's that experience of always asking the question, what if? I think that in particular, not fears, but 6s are in a challenging place right now because fear is like very present for us in our world today. Our world is objectively kind of a scary place to be. And so 6s have to be really careful with that because if you get, you're a 6 and you get into a group of 6s and all of a sudden you find yourselves or a large group of people making decisions that are based in a place of anxiety and fear, things can get even more scary very, very quickly.
You find yourself needing to be prepared for a whole lot of different circumstances that aren't necessarily manageable.
Yes, totally. So here are a couple of traits of 6s. They tend to appreciate order and consistency. They really love plans and rules and having a structure to follow. 6s tend to value community at their core. They are loyal to community, they're loyal to people, they won't abandon communities or people over matters of like disagreement or argument. One of the examples given in the book is that 6s, like in church settings and church communities, feel really invested and connected. And so they often will not walk away if there's some kind of agreement or disagreement or challenge that they're faced with. They will stick around, be a part of the community, see themselves as involved in it, and figure out a way to a solution. So I think that's pretty cool.
Those sound like great people to have
right?
present in our building.
I know. 6s have an amazing ability to bond people together. So like I said earlier, they're kind of the glue of our society. They also tend to have a lot of doubts and a lot of questions. So they sometimes feel themselves pulled in one direction or pulled in another direction. I'm thinking maybe a little bit of the experience of the 4s, but with a different core, since 6s are are part of the head triad. This is also a really interesting fact about sixes that is unique to them. No other number on the Enneagram has us experience, but there are technically two different types of sixes. So one type is the phobic six, and the other type would be called a counterphobic six. So phobic sixes tend to give their full attention to authority because that's where security is. So sixes are always looking for the best way to be secure in themselves, secure in their surroundings, secure in kind of all areas of their life. So phobic sixes appreciate and value authority. They aim to please. They are really good at following the rules. Counterphobic sixes are wary of authority figures. They seek security by provoking a perceived threat that they might have and then conquering it. So sixes tend to be kind of like back and forth on the Enneagram. They're one of those numbers that's like hard to pin down and contain. So even though they seem like straightforward, I think the bottom line is that sixes actually are not. They're pretty complex.
I remember reading that and being fascinated that
Yeah.
this number, I mean, right? Because all of our numbers have different ways we lean, but to actually be identified and separated into two specific sections like that, beyond the stress, the security, and the wings.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of movement within the six.
Right. And most sixes move somewhere between phobic and counterphobic, so they might lean more, kind of like wings, they lean more towards one or the other, but they kind of shift back and forth between them. But the interesting thing about it is that the focus for both phobic and counterphobic sixes is where they find and how highly they place authority, and especially authority in relationship to security. For sixes, the childhood wound that they would have, the message they would have heard somewhere growing up is that the world isn't a safe place and the adults who are in charge can't always be trusted. So sixes learn to worry pretty early on. As a result, they likely, though, were good listeners and good rule followers when they were in school. There is also a theory or thought that sixes might have grown up in unstable conditions when they were young. That may or may not apply to everybody, but it could be something that leans more towards the traits of a six.
It would make a lot of sense, though. I mean, if you think about six being what's viewed to be potentially the dominant number,
Right.
I mean, a lot of our world has grown up in unstable conditions
Yeah.
of some sort.
Absolutely. Yep. So I can share a little bit about stresses and securities. When sixes are stressed, they tend to look like unhealthy threes. So stressed sixes get into a real like workaholic life pattern. They tend to acquire resources because that helps them to feel secure. So to have things around them, physical things to help support that. When threes are feeling secure, they tend to look more like healthy nines. So they are accepting, they tend to be a little bit more like lighthearted and joyous, and they really are able to internalize that message that it will all be okay. Would one of you be willing to share a little bit about wings for sixes?
Yeah. So sixes, their wings are going to be either a 5 or a 7. These sixes are the ones with the 5s are a little more introverted, coming from that investigator observer piece.
Sure.
Intellectual, cautious, self-controlled, and apt to seek security through allegiance to authority figures. Sixes with that 7 wing are a delightful surprise, reflecting the playfulness of a 7 who is the enthusiast. They're entertaining, animated, and adventuresome, willing to take a risk, albeit only a little risk, so that the boundaries of a 6 aren't stretched too far.
So they're adventurous, but with a backup plan. I love it.
That's a
Yeah.
good way of looking at it.
This is a sort of a sweet story from a 6 in my life who was going on a trip and told me that they had spent an inordinate amount of time searching for one of those teeny tiny screwdrivers for their glasses in case the glasses somehow broke on this trip, that they would have a backup plan in place. And I think that just embodies a 6, like totally.
Yeah, sixes that I've been the closest to, you know, you've got a purse, and then you've got the mom purse that like has everything that you could ever possibly need,
Yes.
and delighted to lug that 70-pound purse around,
Yes.
no matter where they went.
It's so true. And you don't have to be a
You don't have to
mom
be
to
a
have a
s-
mom.
Yeah, I was
purse.
saying, you don't have to be
No.
a 6 to have a mom.
It's so true. Okay, so here's the healing message for sixes that they need to hear, and it's centered all around the idea of trust. Trust. And so trusting that there is a higher spiritual truth that is that you already are ultimately safe, and that this story that we are a part of and that we are journeying through together ultimately ends well.
Very nice.